Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In today's video, I'm going to bring you into chapter 12 and talk about the overhead squat assessment. And in particular, the issue of when you're doing this assessment, an individual's arms are falling forward. Now, just keep in mind that for the most part, the overhead squat assessment, and I'm on page 388, it's designed to simply, assess the dynamic components or dynamic, as they say, posture, core stability, neuromuscular control of the whole body during a squatting motion. Again, the overhead squat assessment is kind of your, I guess you would say, your go-to. If you only had to do one assessment, it would be the overhead squat assessment. Of course, NASM wants you to also know the single leg, the pulling assessment, the pushing assessment. They're all very helpful, but this one for sure gives you the most information, the most bang for your buck, because it does tell you not only about the ankle, the knee, the LPHC, but the upper body. And this is where I get questions because students will ask me, well, why does that even matter that my arms are falling forward? And the answer to that is because it's one of the better ways, or the easier ways from an assessment perspective, to look at how the muscles of the shoulder girdle, i.e. the scapulae and glenohumeral joint complex, are interplaying with overactive and underactive muscles. So the idea is that if we can get a good idea of what's going on in the middle part of the back, the lats, and those other muscles that are responsible for moving the scapula, retraction, protraction, extension, flexion at the shoulder, you get a better idea potentially of where you might see some problematic issues, muscle imbalances, i.e. overactive and underactive muscles. So that's why the overhead squat assessment is a really valuable tool. On page 388, sure, you can read through it. Now, again, from a testing perspective, you're not going to need to know the actual logistics of performing the assessment necessarily. I don't think I've heard students tell me that they've had questions on, what's the start position, what's the end position, how's the actual movement performed. Of course, you could read through it, but the whole point here is you want to memorize, and the goal when I go over this particular area in chapter 12 is to help you to understand the memorization part, the overactive and underactive muscles. Again, that's from a testing perspective. So when you go to page 390, you're going to see these figures. Figure 1210 is, people can have a lower arch in their lower back that is not necessarily problematic unless there is a muscle imbalance causing this extreme anterior rotation of the pelvis. And then, of course, there's the arms falling forward, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, by the way, once you're in chapter 12 and looking at any of your actual movement dynamic assessments, movement assessments, they basically give you two types of charts. One is what you would use, and NASM is just giving you the observational findings sheet. In this case, it's table 12.4. You're not going to be tested on that. Okay, so this is what you would potentially use if you were actually going, once you get clients, once you go through and you pass the NASM exam, then if you wanted to, you would go back and you can use these actual findings sheets. That's what they're there for. From a testing perspective, you're not dealing with any of that. From a testing perspective, you are on table 12.5. And what I want to do is get you to look over on page 392 onto the second part of the solutions chart, right? The overhead squat assessment solutions chart. And I want you to take a look over where the columns, and these columns have the joint. So it's the LPHC, right? In this particular instance, the viewpoint is from a lateral, i.e. looking at a person from the side. Now, this is critical. When you're doing an overhead squat assessment, you're going to look at an individual from the front, and you'll be able to see movement disruptions, right, of the knees turning in or whatever the case is. But from the side, when I'm looking at a person and I'm watching them go up and down, this is where I'm going to be able to see these other potential issues that they're, or what they call movement patterns. So you got the joint that it's occurring at, or that you're looking at. The viewpoint is from a lateral from the side, they're facing this way and I'm looking at them this way, right? The movement impairment in this case is the arms fall forward. So you're doing it, and the arms, and you can see on the picture that ideally the arms should remain straight up in the air. As I squat down, my arms should not come forward from my torso. In other words, they should not extend. So this is shoulder extension. Remember, shoulder flexion is going to be up this way. Shoulder extension is the opposite movement. So essentially what's happening when the arms are falling forward is that the muscles that extend, listen, that extend the shoulder itself and simultaneously allow for protraction of the shoulder girdle. Okay, stay with me. Those are the muscles that are generally imbalanced or unbalanced, i.e., the muscles that should be strong and holding the retracted state of the scapula, the muscles that should be holding my arm up in this flexed state up here, those muscles, for some reason, whatever reason, are not doing their job. And then the other muscles that are actually pulling the arms, that are extending the arms down this way, for some reason, they're pulling too hard. They're too strong. And this is where we get into this concept of overactive and underactive muscles. And so on page 392, you're going to look at the movement impairment, arms fall forward. What are the possible muscle imbalances? Okay, this is the critical point of memorization. Now, what I do, paper, pen, you got to write these down. You got to physically write these down. Before you do anything else, do yourself a big favor. Write them down. What are your overactive, and write one side overactive and then the other side underactive. And that's all you're doing is write those muscles down. Your latissimus dorsi, potentially overactive. Why? Because kinesiologically, the function of the latissimus dorsi is to adduct, extend, and medially rotate the humerus. So it's not a bad idea. And I've told students this as well when they're asking me, how do I memorize some of this? A good way to do it is to memorize the muscle, just as they have it listed here, but also kind of learn, or at least memorize, what the kinesiological function of that muscle is. Because, you know, sometimes if you can't remember certain things, it's a good idea to have memorized kinesiology. And that's what I'm kind of help you here with, is that the lats, and I'm just saying this is what the lats do, they extend. So therefore, if they are overactive, they are going to pull the arm down, right? And that's why we see, it's one of the reasons why we see the arms falling forward as an individual does the squat. So the lats, the pectoralis major and minor. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, why would those guys be tight? And I don't have any issues with NASM putting those muscles in there as overactive. The problem is that in general, the only time we really see the pectoralis major pulling the arms down is when the arms are in this up position over here. Now, remember, the kinesiological function of the pectoralis major is to actually flex the shoulder, right? So flexion, shoulder flexion. It also adducts. But what happens is that when the arm is in a almost hyperflex position, which is what you see in the overhead squat assessment, it's almost in a hyperflex position, the pectoralis major actually will try and neutralize the position of the shoulder back down to this position. In conjunction with an overactive lat, boy, that guy's going to pull down like this every time, every day of the week. You got to memorize that. So I basically write down overactive latissimus or lats, pectoralis major and minor, and then the teres major, and that's the posterior shoulder muscle. Now, just keep in mind the teres major. If you don't know it, go to Appendix C, by the way, because that's where all the muscle functions are. You could do that. But the teres major has been called the little lat, if you've ever heard that term. The teres major, for the most part, has a very similar function to the latissimus dorsi. So it's not a surprise to see a muscle like the teres major. By the way, don't get confused with the with the rotator cuff muscle, the teres minor. This is the teres major, which is very similar to the latissimus dorsi. So the fact that it's in there as a potential overactive makes a lot of sense because it's going to do something very similar to the lats. Not so much on the adduction component, kinesiological function, but more in the extension component. So the teres major will help and assist with extending the shoulder. And there is some offshoot kinesiological function of adduction, but that's not what we're interested here on this part. So those are your overactive lats. Let me see if I can remember these. Lats, pectoralis major, minor, teres major. Okay, got it. Okay, write it down over and over and over, and you'll never have any issues. You won't be able to forget it. You'll have nightmares about it. Underactive. Okay, this can be a little bit more challenging to memorize because there's 4 of them. So middle and lower trapezius, those would be your mid-back muscles. And why? Because what do the middle and lower fibers of the traps do to your scapula? And remember, there's the shoulder joint. Remember, this is one of the issues that we have in explaining what's known as glenohumeral rhythm, right? The shoulder joint and the scapula movement, protraction and retraction of the scapula. And so those movement patterns, the ability of the shoulder to move forward and backward, right, which is involved when we do the overhead squat assessment. Those guys allow for movement of the scapula, and those are going to be your traps, your rhomboids. And of course, they're going to put the posterior deltoid and portions of the rotator cuff, right? Small muscles that stabilize the shoulder. I would just write it down as mid-lower traps, rhomboids, right? The rhomboids lie underneath the traps, and they are responsible for a fair amount of the retraction and rotation of the scapula. But again, Appendix C, go back here, take a look at it, and you should know for the most part what the kinesiological function of these muscles are. It's very helpful. Posterior delts, right, back of the shoulder. If those guys are underactive, they simply allow the shoulder to obviously rotate forward, which is going to be part of this downward motion of the arms during the movement pattern. Portions of the rotator cuff, and they don't tell you what those muscles are. I'm not sure why they put it in there. You might as well just say it. Okay, the internal rotators, right? Your external rotators are your infraspinatus and teres minors. You got your subscapularis and supraspinatus to a small extent. But the infra and the teres minor are your external rotators. Now, if those guys are lengthened, they will allow for internal rotation, which will assist with this problem. So they could have just said the external rotators are going to be lengthened and weakened. Just so you know, that is not uncommon. That's not uncommon for the average person to have weak external rotators. If the external rotators are weak, those muscles that externally rotate this way and externally rotate this way, if they're weak, they will lengthen and allow for the muscles of the pectoralis to pull and adduct, and simultaneously with the lats to extend. And that's one of the reasons why we see this movement of the arms forward. Okay, so the point of this video is to help you to understand a little bit more about the mechanics and the underlying reasons, muscular wise. We see this from a purely testing perspective. Remember, memorize the muscles, memorize them, memorize the view, and understand how you're looking at the individual. And that's what's going to help you. That's going to help you the most when it comes to answering these types of questions. Now, keep in mind, every Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a Zoom call that pulls you into Quizlet. Okay, Quizlet Live. And what we want you to do is to click into the link that you have in your student portal, right? We have a direct link that takes you to the live study. We use Quizlet Live. It creates a little competitive environment. Lots of fun, very helpful from a studying perspective. So keep that in mind. If you want more information specifically on how to get access to the entire NASM study course that we provide at Body Design University, click on the link in the description below. And by the way, leave a comment if you understood what I went over and it actually makes sense, or you already knew it anyway, and maybe it helped tweak it a little bit better for you, then just write the word understood inside the comment section. As always, let us know how we can be of assistance. If you got other questions related to this particular area or other areas of the NASM 7th edition textbook, we are more than happy to take a look at the comment and perhaps even create another additional video on it. As always, have a great week. We'll see you next week.